Well, top Democrats were evacuated from the DNC's headquarters last night after protesters calling for a ceasefire in Gaza clashed with police. We're going to bring you the latest details. Violent protests outside the Democratic National Committee's Washington headquarters, forcing top House Democrats to be evacuated from the building. The demonstration calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, it escalated rapidly, with protesters shoving police and grabbing onto metal barricades as officers moved to make arrests. About 10 members of Congress, including House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries, House Democratic whip Katherine Clark, and number 3 Democrat Pete Aguilar, were all inside before being escorted from the area.
And breaking overnight, one person was arrested, 6 officers injured after a protest turned violent in Washington, D.C. Members of Congress, including top House Democrats, were evacuated as tensions erupted between police and protesters. Demonstrators outside the Democratic National Committee, they were calling for a ceasefire in Gaza.
But the physical altercations erupted, and they spilled out into the street, onto the sidewalk behind me. And look, organizers had said the plan was to block entrances around this building, around the DNC headquarters, to force some of the members of Congress, including leadership, Hakeem Jeffries, Katherine Clark, Pete Aguilar, to come out of the building and be confronted by protesters who were calling for a ceasefire. But we never got to that point because the scene erupted, and those members of Congress, close to a dozen of them, had to be evacuated from the building. One of those members of Congress, Representative Sean Casten, tweeted out, he said, "You have the constitutional right to peaceably assemble and protest," speaking about the protesters outside, but blocking all entries to a building with multiple members of Congress in it, protected by Capitol Police officers who have lived through January 6th, is putting you and other innocent people at risk. And look, we know that both sides, police and the progressive Jewish organizations that organize this protest, that have organized many in recent weeks, overnight, they're pointing the finger at the other side, saying it is the other party that's really to blame for escalating the scene. Capitol Police tweeting out saying that 6 officers were treated for minor injuries. They said 1 person arrested, as you mentioned, for assault of an officer. But their language was interesting. They said, "We appreciate our officers who kept these illegal and violent protesters back and protected everyone in the area." And look, the organizations that were involved tell a very different story. If Not Now, one of those organizations, put out a statement saying protesters non-violently blocked one entrance to the DNC headquarters, the one behind me. Police violently attacked them, and it led to 90 injuries, including being pepper sprayed, minor cuts, and dragged by the hair.
And coming up, members of Congress, including top House Democrats, evacuated after violent struggles between the police and protesters right here in Washington, D.C. What it says about the politics of the president's own party as he is facing a re-election bid. Now to an anti-war rally that turned violent. This was the scene outside the Democratic National Committee headquarters right here in Washington last night. Protesters were demanding a ceasefire in Gaza, but ended up clashing with police. The top 3 House Democrats were all inside the building at the time and had to be evacuated. It's another sign of the growing divide among Democrats over President Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas war. Our great reporters are back. And Laura, I mean, that isn't quite an image. We haven't seen an image like that since January 6th. Totally different topic, totally different kind of people. I mean, I don't want to at all compare the sort of substance of it, but the idea that there was violence and that there were Capitol Police officers actually hurt there.
I believe there are about 6 Capitol Police officers that were injured, according to the Capitol Police that put out that report last night. But there are key differences. I wouldn't compare it to January 6th, but it was a clash, and the protesters or the ralliers were standing outside and blocking the entryways and the exitways, and that's why police confronted them and tried to get them to move, because people couldn't exit or enter
and not
the
just
building.
People, like
right.
the most senior House Democrats.
Most senior House Democrats and lawmakers who were there for an event. And so that's what ultimately led to the clash. Look, as you said, Dana, this is showing the fissures among Democrats and among the left that are very frustrated with President Biden.